Donald Trump wants to target Putin and those who trade with Russia. In fact, the American president wants a law that allows the United States to sanction Russia and to impose tariffs of up to 100% against countries that help the Kremlin circumvent Western sanctions or that continue to buy Russian gas and oil. The measure could therefore put pressure on China and India, but also on Japan and even some European countries. I saw that many of you watch my videos and I'm really happy about it, but you're not subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, subscribe. It's free for you, but it's really vital for the channel. Thank you so much. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the United States, the European Union, and other Western countries introduced sanctions with the goal of slowing down the Russian economy and Moscow's ability to sustain the war. And this by reducing access to the Western financial system, to technologies, and by limiting Russian revenues from gas and oil exports. As a result, banks, companies, and people close to Putin have been targeted. With Europe having reduced purchases of Russian energy and the G7 countries setting a price cap on oil exported from Moscow, that is, a limit on the price at which Russia can sell its oil by sea using Western services. It means that Western shipping and insurance companies can offer their services to Russia only if the oil is sold below this limit. And this approach was chosen instead of a total ban because the West did not want to instantly remove millions of Russian barrels from the market. Because a sharp reduction in supply would have caused energy prices to rise and would have hurt Western countries as well, not just Russia. Russia, however, was forced to accept lower prices in order to keep trading, and the results were immediate. In the first 9 months of 2023, Russia's oil-related tax revenues, that is, the taxes the state collects from oil sales, fell by more than 40% compared to 2022. And the Kremlin was thus forced to develop a shadow fleet made up of old oil tankers, opaque companies, and non-Western operators. This allowed them to transport some oil without relying on Western-controlled services. Russia has also redirected a significant portion of its exports, which previously went to Europe, towards Asia. Just think. In 2020, Europe received 51% of Russian oil exports, while in 2024, this share dropped to 12%, and in the first half of 2025, it even fell to 11%. Meanwhile, during the same period, Asia and Oceania went from receiving 41% of the oil exported by Russia in 2020 to 81% in 2022, with China and India being the main buyers. Just think, China imported an average of 2.2 million barrels per day in 2024 and 2 million in the first half of 2025. Meanwhile, India went from about 50,000 barrels per day in 2020 to 1.7 million in 2024 and to an average of 1.6 million in the first half of 2025. However, keep in mind, these purchases do not make the two countries allies of Russia because in India's case, what matters most is economic convenience and the need for energy. On the other hand, China considers Russia a very useful partner, but it follows its own interests and has an increasingly strong position towards Moscow. Not to mention the fact that the Kremlin is still forced to sell at a steep discount to these countries since it can sell almost exclusively to them. However, the fact remains that these deals allow Russia to support its public budget and to continue the conflict. That's why the Americans have been working on this front for months, and now the new bill aims to target those who finance Russia. But what exactly does this bill provide for? The first version of this bill was introduced in April 2025 and included broader measures such as general tariffs that could reach up to 500% against countries that purchased energy and other Russian products. Then the bill was stalled for over a year because many lawmakers considered the proposal too extreme and thought it could even harm Ukraine's own allies. The version agreed in July 2026 with the White House capped tariffs at 100% and applied them only to the 5 largest crude oil or gas buyers. Di petrolio greggio o gas russo. In addition to the 5 main countries considered responsible for helping bypass American sanctions, and so, at the end of July, the Senate approved a first step to move the bill forward. And even though the measure still has to pass other votes in the Senate, be approved by the House, and receive the President's signature, things are moving forward for now. Anyway, as you can imagine, when it comes to geopolitics, it's not easy to really understand what's going on. Also because every news outlet interprets events through its own editorial line, and the result is that some news can be emphasized while others risk going unnoticed. For example, a news outlet close to Russia might downplay a Ukrainian success. On the other hand, a Western news outlet might give less coverage to Ukraine's difficulties. For this reason, in my opinion, the best approach is to compare multiple sources. This way, you can get different perspectives and build an opinion based on facts. Anyway, the law would impose sanctions against Putin, against high-ranking Russian officials, and against the oligarchs, including some family members who support Moscow's war effort. Russian financial institutions would also be targeted, including the central bank, along with major energy projects like Yamal and LNG. The measure would also target the shadow fleet, hitting oil tankers and intermediaries. But the most interesting part concerns the tariffs on countries that buy from Russia, especially because some of the biggest buyers may surprise you. In fact, according to American sources, among the largest importers of Russian oil are China, India, and Slovakia, along with Hungary and Azerbaijan. While among the main importers of gas notably are China, France, and Japan, along with Hungary and Belgium. Now, the countries involved are not directly mentioned in the law, and the text provides an exception for countries that are taking significant steps to reduce their purchases of Russian energy, a clause that could specifically protect Japan, France, Hungary, and Belgium. But this does not weaken the power of secondary tariffs. In fact, secondary sanctions allow the United States to target a person, a bank, or a company that continues to work with entities already sanctioned by Washington. So an Indian bank that helps a Russian company receive payments could find itself excluded from the American financial system and from the SWIFT system, which allows payments to be made worldwide. But in reality, however, the secondary tariffs provided for by this law would have a much broader scope because they could target products coming from an entire country based on its purchases of Russian energy. To be clear, a Chinese manufacturer with no direct ties to Russia could still face consequences because its government continues to buy Russian oil. And keep in mind, by consequences, I mean tariffs of 100%. Such a measure would therefore reduce the competitiveness of exports and could harm much broader economic sectors than those that benefit from trade with Russia. A government could therefore be forced to weigh the savings from buying Russian oil against the losses caused by American tariffs on its exports to the United States. And China in particular would be exposed to especially broad consequences considering the value of its trade with Washington. Meanwhile, India would have to balance its interest in buying Russian energy at favorable prices with the need to protect its economic and strategic relationship with the United States. In short, the pressure could push the two countries to reduce their purchases or to ask Russia for even bigger discounts to compensate for the losses caused by the tariffs. However, this law appears to give the president significant control over which countries to target, how hard, and for how long. So Trump could use the threat of tariffs even without actually applying them, asking the governments involved to reduce their purchases from Russia or to cooperate with American sanctions. But why does Trump support this law though? Wasn't he particularly soft on Putin? To understand the support for this law, we need to start with Lindsey Graham, one of the main supporters of Ukraine within the Republican Party, who unfortunately passed away in July 2026. His passing therefore gave this law, which he himself had been working on, a boost because many American lawmakers want to honor his memory by passing this very law. However, it seems that Trump's support also depends on the changes in his relationships with Moscow on one side and with Kyiv on the other. In fact, the American president began to support the measure just as his confidence in Kyiv's military capabilities was growing, and at the same time, his frustration with Putin was also increasing. And in early July 2026, Trump had also met with Zelensky during the NATO summit in Ankara, already showing a more collaborative attitude compared to the past. So much so that during the meeting, Trump also announced the granting of a license to Ukraine to produce Patriot system interceptors. However, in my opinion, there is also a third element at play. Trump sees tariffs as a way to pressure other countries for commercial and geopolitical concessions, threaten tariffs, and they comply to avoid them. So this law could allow him to threaten China and India to push them to reduce their purchases from Russia. But Trump could also use this law to obtain other concessions that Washington needs, perhaps in exchange for turning a blind eye to the trade between those two countries and Moscow. Or even start an even broader negotiation. We can't know this for sure, but we certainly know how Trump uses tariffs and the possibility of using them. And it's reasonable to think that for Trump, this measure has become even more important after the Supreme Court's decision in February 2026. The court had overturned the tariffs introduced by Trump himself in 2025, pushing the administration to look for new legislative grounds to apply the tariffs. Anyway, for the senators who support Ukraine, the law is meant to reduce the Kremlin's resources, while for Trump it could represent a way to obtain new trade powers to use not only with Moscow and its partners, but also more broadly. But can this strategy really hurt Putin? Oil is the main source of profit for the Kremlin to finance the invasion of Ukraine, and the energy sector is also crucial for Russia's access to foreign currency. Russia has foreign currency, which is useful when you can hardly use rubles abroad, so the pressure on buyers could reduce these revenues either because of fewer purchases due to fear of sanctions or because of demands for bigger discounts to compensate for the risks of American sanctions. China could say, "I'll keep buying your oil, but you must give me a bigger discount since I'm risking risking sanctions. And a similar mechanism has already been observed with the price cap because the increase in Western restrictions has contributed to widening the discounts. According to the US Treasury Department, between October 2023 and February 2024, the discount went from about $12 or $13 to about $19 per barrel, even temporarily reaching $20 in January 2024. And keep in mind, this means earning $20 less for every single barrel. That's not a small amount. Then, sanctions against the shadow fleet, against banks, and against intermediaries would obviously increase the costs of transporting oil and also of receiving payments, further squeezing Russia's margins. But it's also true that the effect remains uncertain, because it depends a lot on the reaction of China and India. Beijing, for example, may see the tariffs as a threat to its interests and respond with counter-tariffs. This wouldn't be new for Beijing. Meanwhile, New Delhi might seek exemptions or only limit a portion of Russian imports. Even though India in the past, we have to say, has already shown itself to be quite sensitive to the issue of secondary sanctions and had actually already reduced its purchases of Russian oil in recent months. We also talked about it here. Then there is also the risk that a sharp reduction in Russian exports could drive up the international price of oil, allowing Russia to compensate for some of the lower volumes with higher revenues from the remaining sales. In short, secondary tariffs are more aggressive and their effectiveness will depend on the Americans' ability to make the cost of dealing with Russia higher than the benefits gained from buying its energy. And then there's also the risk that the law could be blocked. In fact, the procedural vote approved in the Senate with 86 votes in favor and 12 against does show broad consensus on the need to increase economic pressure against Russia, but it doesn't solve the issue. The disagreements over the powers that would be granted to the president. Many Democrats and some Republicans do support the goal of targeting Russian finances, but at the same time they fear that Trump could use the law to impose much broader tariffs with negative effects on inflation and trade, just like what happened in 2025 when Trump imposed tariffs on almost the entire world. So, the main issue concerns the power of the White House because the president could target entire countries with high tariffs but could also suspend the measures if he wanted to, generating paradoxically opposite fears between those who worry about excessive use of tariffs and those who fear they might not be applied at all. The law could also set a precedent that some consider dangerous because it would allow the United States to target trade relations based on a country's relationship with a third power. And this could lead the world to move further and further away from American systems. Because who knows who the United States will be friends with in 20 years, as is already partly happening anyway. In short, the process remains uncertain, also because the Senate still has to hold a final vote, and the House, which will return to session after August 31st, will probably be even more complicated, so we could see the law approved, scrapped, or undergo further changes.